You know, back in the good old days, in 2002, 2006, when you got a listing, it was like having a paycheck. Properties sold so fast you could hardly keep up. Everything was just moving. Back then, there wasn't such a thing as an REO listing, a real estate owned asset. An asset that is a piece of property foreclosed upon by a bank and now being resold by that bank. Then there was the crash. And then there was no loans, there were no listings, there were no buyers. Everyone was afraid to do anything with real estate. The banks foreclosed and foreclosed and foreclosed and had huge amounts of inventory and then dumped it onto the marketplace because that's what they did in the olden days. Right up until the prices dropped through the floor, the banks discovered they were losing more money on the assets that they had not even yet foreclosed upon or on the assets that they had already foreclosed upon but hadn't released, so they stopped. They stopped listing the properties that they had foreclosed on. That was called shadow inventory. What did the brokers do then? There was nothing to sell. There was nothing to represent a buyer to buy. The brokers were starving. So they did BPOs, broker price opinions, in order to eat. They did those BPOs for the banks, hoping to get those REO listings, hoping to establish those relationships with the only sellers then in town, the banks. It's a love-hate relationship, that relationship between the banks and the brokers. They don't trust each other. They come to real estate from two entirely different perspectives. From the broker's perspective, a home is not a commodity. It's sometimes an investment, but most of the time it's that American dream. It's where you put the third kid. It's where you go after a divorce. It's where you go when you've been transferred. It's where you go to retire. It is a place that their customers get to believe and feel and act and have as their own, their piece of the American pie. From a bank's perspective, an REO asset is a drain. It's a commodity. It's get it off the books as fast as we can and get the money back so that we can reinvest that money in something that will make us dollars. Because right now, from the bank's perspective, all real estate does is lose money. So the banks have a very different mindset about what this real estate represents. And I'm talking about the residential marketplace. The commercial marketplace is a little bit different, but only a little bit different. In the residential context, the banks don't do transfer disclosure statements. They don't have to, but they also don't do the required disclosures either, and they're supposed to do that. The purchase agreements that the banks give to a prospective buyer are lengthy. They're not on a standardized form, and they really are pretty much a take it or leave it kind of circumstance. So what does a broker do in that kind of a market? Remember, the broker still has fiduciary duties. You still have to counsel your client, the buyer. You have to counsel your client, the seller, to not breach its legal duties if the bank will listen. So properties get sold pretty much any way that they can. And right now, the all-cash buyer, the all-cash investor is coming in and gobbling up property faster than it can be brought to market. In fact, right now, there are bidding wars. Right now, we see again 4, 5, and 6 offers on a single piece of property, all cash offers. The regular buyer, the people that we think of in those divorces or after making new babies or after being transferred, they're competing with investors who are taking no prisoners. So it's a difficult market for a traditional buyer. Those investors, they're buying those properties from the banks on what they think of as a deal. And then they're turning around and selling those properties to the traditional buyer. The investors are making money. Right up until the time when that leaky roof or that cracked foundation comes to the attention of the traditional buyer who doesn't have unlimited cash to fix it. who put 20% down and got an 80% loan. Remember what it used to be when you had to qualify with 20% down and 32% scores on the real estate portion? 32% ratios on the real estate portion. So what happens when a claim arises about a non-disclosed defect? The buyer sues that investor seller, who then turns around and sues the broker for non-disclosure. And the broker says, but wait a minute, we gave all of that information to the bank and it was the bank that didn't disclose. Except that the listing agreement with the bank requires the broker to indemnify the bank. Or you remember that BPO that was done way back when by some agent at the brokerage that's not even there anymore? That BPO is what the bank used to determine the value of that property before it was sold as an REO asset. And that BPO disclosed the cracked foundation and the leaky roof. The agent that sold it years later didn't even know the BPO existed. The brokerage is now held responsible because it's deemed to have known everything that's in that BPO. Is it a landmine? Sure it is. Is it a field full of landmines? Sure it is. Is an REO listing the same as a listing 15 years ago or 10 years ago or even 5 years ago? The equivalent of a paycheck? It can be. It can also be the equivalent of a deductible check that you write to lawyers because you've now been sued. Be careful. Be careful about the listing agreement, that blanket listing agreement that you get from a bank. Be careful about the disclosures that are made. Just because the market has changed, the duties a broker owes in this market haven't. Unclear about what you need to do? Come and talk to us.